Well, hello again. This presentation is on the mining and marketing of mineral specimens. And I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Peter Megaw, who is the president and founder of International Mineral Development and Exploration, and also the exhibits chairman of the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show for the last 35 years. Uh, I think I've probably been to all of those, Peter, since the last 35 years, ever since my wife uh, saw the possibilities of Christmas presents out of it. And Peter and his daughter, Lauren Megaw, are the co-founders of the Young Mineral Collectors. And Lauren, you also have another job these days, don't you?
Yeah, I do investor relations for a silver exploration company, so more on the traditional side of mining uh, as well. So came in from the minerals, and now I'm on the more of the exploration side.
Good. Well, today we're going to talk about some of the practical and legal issues in the mineral specimen industry. And Peter, to start off with, why don't you give us some of your background? Where you're born, where you got your education, and how'd you get into this business?
Well, I'm originally a Yankee from northwestern Massachusetts, but filtered through 10 years in Austin, Texas. Went to the University of Texas for my bachelor's and master's. Was invited during that process to come out to the Tucson show. I came out, walked around with eyes the size of dinner plates for about 3 days. Had no idea that there were more mineral specimens in the world than filled mineral museums. So when the opportunity to take a job in Tucson versus Denver came along, I jumped at it. Worked here for a couple of years, downturn in the market, got my doctorate at the U of A, had the privilege of taking your mining law course in the process, and have been involved with mineral exploration ever since. I joined the Tucson Gem and Mineral Society within a matter of days of when I arrived in Tucson, and have latched onto the job as exhibits chair for the show. So I've been deeply involved with the whole world of mineral collecting, marketing. I paid for part of my doctorate by importing minerals from Mexico. So I've been involved with it from digging all the way to marketing.
So when you came to Tucson, you were really started out in the mineral collection business?
Yeah, I didn't really know anything about the mineral collecting business. I knew about import export, but I didn't know anything about the mineral business before I came to the Tucson show, and it changed my life.
Excellent. Well, certainly for the better. Why don't we talk about the specimen industry itself and the modern history of mineral collections?
Well, there's mineral specimen collecting has a long history. Probably really came to prominence in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when nobility and aristocrats of one kind or another in Europe began to collect specimens, exchange them king to king, queen to queen, czarina to czarina. And so you saw a lot of that develop, especially through the Victorian era. It spread into the United States at about the same time. A number of the what are now referred to as robber barons were famous as big mineral collections that include people like J.P. Morgan. And these individual collections that were put together sort of here and there, mostly by people recognizing an interesting group of rocks, specimens, crystals that were found in a mine as being of collector slash scientific interest. This was before the science got terribly complicated. These some large collections were amassed, and then they were donated to places like the American Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian, the Natural History Museum in London, the Sorbonne in Paris, and these were sort of the nuclei of some of the world's big institutional collections. Since that time, especially after the Second World War, there was a dramatic increase in interest in specimens, lapidary, this kind of thing, and it really took on within what you might call the middle class and became affordable and accessible to people. And that all coincides with the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show getting started in 1954 and gradually becoming what is now the world's largest gem and mineral event that draws specimens, collectors, museum curators, and other assorted hangers-on to Tucson every year.
Now, I think that some of our listeners might not understand the distinction when you talk about lapidary. You want to talk a little bit about what that means?
Sure. So it's very simple. Mineral specimens are natural crystals as they come out of the ground. Now, sometimes they've been cleaned, trimmed, and prepared a little bit. We'll talk more about that later, probably. A lapidary specimen is something that has been polished, whether it's a rounded polish to make what's called a cabochon, which typically goes in a piece of jewelry, or faceted to make a gemstone. So lapidary is materials that have been worked. Specimens are natural crystal specimens.
Okay. And Lauren, you want to jump in here and talk about some of your background and what your experience is with collection, other than tagging? I suspect your father is probably going to just put you out there on those hot summer collection episodes.
For me, I fell in love with minerals in sort of a two-parter. One was, the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show. There's this amazing community that I grew up in. And the other component is that my dad would be working in Mexico, and he would come home with a shoebox of mineral specimens that were sort of the product of mining operations that were happening in Mexico. People come across beautiful mineral specimens, they collect it, and he would bring those back, and we would sit down, and it's like Christmas, right? Because he would come home and you'd unwrap it and you'd talk about the geology and the type of mineral specimen and where it came from. And that turned into putting together my own collection, then competing with my collection. Actually ended up winning all the awards at the Tucson Gem Mineral Show with my pieces, which sort of allowed me to get critique and grow my collection as well as improve it. And I did an internship at Harvard, partially based out of relationships that I made, being a part of the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show. And that kind of dovetails into, I guess what we can talk about in terms of the type of collections. So one of the beautiful things about the collecting community is that you get this broad range of people, whether it's people that are really into what we call species. So, they want to collect a whole bunch of specimens that are a broad range of geochemical. They're very technical in terms of their approach. So you get that as sort of one end of the spectrum. And you can get locality collectors where they're like, I love Mexico. My dad is one of those. And so, the component there is they really get to understand the depth of a particular area. Some people collect a single species, so they'll just collect calcite, or they'll collect wolfenite, or one of these other specimens that really captures their imagination, and they collect it from all over the world. And then the other one that you get is more of what we refer to as trophy collections. So those are people who are going after the high dollar, truly exceptional specimens that are the equivalent of a fine piece of art. And then, one of those things is you get one Monet painting, but you can also be in a situation where you have one truly exceptional specimen, whether it's, some of these mining operations in Afghanistan where they'll get these incredible beryl crystals. There's only one helix, which is this one that has like a special growth in it that looks like a big curly Q that's coming up in it. And those are the kind of specimens that really have incredible value add. And some people acquire those specimens not only because they're in love with them and they're really fascinated by minerals, but because of the investment component as well. And that's one of the pieces that kind of goes back into these specimen specific mines. If what your goal is after the mineral specimen, you're really focused on, yes, you're going to have a whole bunch of material. A lot of that's going to go to more of your species collectors or the general collector, but you're going to have maybe if you're lucky, you're going to have a couple of truly great specimens. And that's where the majority of the value in a specimen related mine is.
Yeah, you talk about that you won one of the contests at the Gem and Mineral Show. What sort of contests do they have?
Yeah, so the competition is based off of quality. For the specific specimen, there's different categories. So I can put it in what's called open division, but there's also different size components. And so there's some people that collect only small specimens. There's some people that collect specimens that are a little bit bigger. So they have different size categories. Or you can compete with, hey, I collect everything. Actually, this last year, there was a guy who competed with micro minerals. So the only way you can see them is with a microscope, and he put little photos next to them. Absolutely brilliant. He was one of the young mineral collector group exhibitors. And so, as you make your way up, there's a different point threshold to win an award, as well as competing against other collections. So you put out your 22 best specimens, depends on which size category you're in, but your 22 best specimens, and you're trying to get the highest average score possible. You get bonus points for rarity. And so, it's one of these things where I won all the awards moving up, but I ended up winning an award called Defiance, which is the single best case in competition. And since I've won it, it's become sort of the trophy collectors have been duking it out in Defiance. And so you get these cases with multiple $1 million dollars worth of specimens in this case, and it is just, it's really cool to see where things are going in competition at Tucson Gem Mineral Show. And the exhibits in general, I get to boast about this because he's not going to. But, the Tucson Gem Mineral Show realistically is the best mineral museum in the world, shows up for 4 days and then poof, goes away.
Yeah.
So it's a really great environment.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about the historical mines that were the source of some of the more famous mineral specimens. And so, Peter, you want to jump in here and talk about some of those?
Yeah, delighted to. I should qualify or clarify some of what Lauren was saying is I've been the exhibits chairman for 35 years, but I'm in charge of non-competitive exhibits. So someone else entirely is responsible for competitive, entirely responsible for those judges. I had absolutely nothing to do with how and why she, well, maybe somehow why, but certainly not any direct influence on her winning those awards. She did that all by herself.
Well, I suppose as part of your influence that she got into that business anyway.
So going back to your question about historical mines, probably the standout mine would have to be the silver mines of Kongsberg in Norway. And so back in the early 1800s, these mines were producing the silver that basically supported the Kingdom of Norway. And that mine produced these spectacular ram's horn crystals, sometimes anywhere from 3 to as much as 15 or 16 inches tall, beautiful curly cues of native silver. And these became gifts of state from the King of Norway to virtually every other crowned head in Europe. So a lot of these early collections that were developing in early and middle 1800s are all graced by having these spectacular specimens from Kongsberg. And they've they've become absolute classics in the business. At the same time, the mines of Cornwall were producing beautiful, colorful groups of specimens from the mines that were active there. And those also made their way into a lot of the world's big collections. And so
I think the mines of Cornwall were those mostly tin mines.
They're tin, but they have a lot of copper and they had a lot of base metals in them. And probably what makes them most important is that the ores there contained a lot of arsenic, which was actually one of the major things that people went after. I mean, we think arsenic now and we go, oh my God, that's toxic. And yes, absolutely it is, and it was. But arsenic oxide is one of the most effective rat poisons out there. And in the early 1800s, rat control was a big deal in Europe. I mean, we're just coming off of plagues that were spread by fleas on rats and things like that. So arsenic was a big deal. But when arsenic is in the oxide zone, which is basically where groundwater is infiltrating into these tin, copper, lead, zinc rich ores, it creates these extremely colorful minerals that we call arsenates. And so they were exceptionally well developed in Cornwall. They are still, in many cases, some of the best examples of the arsenate species. And they're extremely popular today, even as collecting. They're harder and harder to get because they've mostly been locked up in museums.
What sort of colors would you have for those arsenic minerals?
Everything from brilliant yellows and reds and greens and blues. I mean, it really runs the spectrum. You mix arsenic with copper and you get blues and greens. You mix arsenic with lead and you get yellows and reds and oranges. So it just, and you mix it with zinc and you get everything from yellow to blue. So it's just a wonderful, the fancy word is chromophore. That just means coloring agent.
Yeah, so people were just collecting minerals for their color as opposed to some sort of crystal crystal parts of it.
Well, they were also interested in the crystallography, and this is all coming from the days before the advent of X-ray crystallography. So this was back in the days when people studied the crystals based on their external shape. And the study of crystallography itself goes back to the Greeks, who considered it a mathematical exercise of how do you fill three-dimensional space endlessly with three-dimensional objects without leaving gaps in between them. So you start with cubes, and then you can go to hexagons like Saltillo tile. You can go to oblongs. There's only 6 different ways you can do that. The Greeks had that figured out 3,000 years ago. And then in the early 20th century, with the advent of X-ray crystallography, it was recognized that those same rules apply all the way down to the atomic level. And that was the first major transformation of crystallography and mineralogy from something other than just aren't these pretty and aren't these cute, and yes, we can define them geometrically, to starting to understand their crystal structure. And in the last 15 years, what we've seen with the advent of even better instrumentation is we can now identify exactly where within the crystal structure the different elements sit. And we can identify different physical and electronic properties of different minerals based on their structure, which now allows us to synthesize those minerals. So mineralogy just in the last 15 years has gone from being sort of a moribund science to an extremely active one.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about some of the other classic mines that have been the source of minerals.
Well, just to follow the arsenate example, we can go to the Ojuela mine in Mexico, which is just outside the city of Torreon. Back in the late 50s, it was recognized that they had some spectacular zinc arsenates in the mine, and those began to flood into the market initially as a trickle, but then because this is during the advent of the Tucson show, these things started to show up in more and more quantity. People started looking at more and more of the old mines of Mexico. More and more specimens came out. At the same time, and going back into the late 1800s, mines like Bisbee were producing spectacular examples of copper carbonates, azurite, malachite, and a whole suite of related species. And they were very large, they were very colorful. They fed into, if you will, the development of collections of American aristocracy and formed the basis for a lot of collections here and were used as trade fodder internationally. So you see these wonderful Bisbee specimens all over the world. In the mid 1950s, the Glove Mine just south of Tucson near Amado in the southern end of the Santa Ritas, walk-in pockets full of these blades of brilliant orange wolfenite, which is now Arizona's official state mineral, were found in that mine. And these things were collected, literally the entire room was collected. And so this was an example of a mine that actually was in active production going for high-grade lead silver mineralization. They broke into these crystal pockets and they mined the crystals and sold them. The people who operated the mines sold them as crystal specimens to wholesalers, and then they worked their way down the channels.
Yeah, they probably made more money off the sale of wolframite than they did with the other minerals.
You know, they would have if they had done it in the context of today's market. But one example is the Defiance Mine, which is down in the Cortland-Gleason district, just 30 miles east of Tombstone. The guy who collected those was a gentleman named Lewis. He was operating the mine. He found this big pocket of wolfenite. He laid the specimens out on boards for sale. And the way he decided his price was he held his fist out at arm's length and he saw how many fists it took to cover the specimen. And it was 50 cents a fist. And he was a large fisted man. So a specimen like this was probably four fists worth. And that was $2. So he, on the other hand, that same specimen today would probably sell for $25,000 or $30,000. So it's all a question of timing.
So I think he probably has a couple left.
His grandson does, and I saw the specimens just the other day. He still lives here in Tucson.
Yeah. The some of my notes here talk about the Sweet Home Mine. Where is that, and what do we have coming out of that?
So the Sweet Home Mine is in central Colorado, just sort of the eastern flank of the Rockies, in a little town called Alma, which is just south of Breckenridge. And it's a mine that was pretty unsuccessful as a metal mine. Had a little bit of tungsten and moly and silver in it, a little bit of copper. But the remarkable thing about the Sweet Home Mine is it produced these spectacular crystals of a mineral called rhodochrosite. Rhodochrosite is just a manganese carbonate, but it forms these blood red rhombohedral crystals up to about that big, sitting on a matrix of white quartz. So the contrast between this brilliant red and white made the specimens that came from that mine quite attractive and quite valuable. And back in the early 80s, a gentleman named Brian Lees, who was a graduate of the Colorado School of Mines, recognized the potential of mining the Sweet Home Mine, not for ore, or actually for ore, but consider the rhodochrosite as the ore that he was shooting for. And so he turned that into one of the first really specimen-focused mining operations here in the US, and sort of led the way in terms of how to do it right. He had financial backers. They went in, they did everything according to all of the various regulations that exist that we can talk about in detail. Prior to that, most mineral specimen collecting was done casually by miners who brought things out in their lunch boxes or sometimes in the back of pickup trucks if they could get that much out of the mine at any one time. But this was a situation where the specimens were the ore, And Brian brought that from nothing to a world famous locality and a highly successful mining operation in by any standards.
Yeah, and his company's called the Collector's Edge. Is that correct?
Correct. They're called Collector's Edge. They're based in Golden, Colorado, so he can still see his alma mater when he wakes up in the morning. And he has bought a house in Tucson, so he will shortly be a part-time, I think, snowbird resident here in Tucson.
Now, I've seen a number of turquoise collections or turquoise samples coming from Mineral Park. Are you familiar with any of that collection?
I am quite familiar with that. I'm more of a specimen guy than a lapidary material person, but turquoise obviously has a long history in this part of the world. Uh, it's a major component of Native American jewelry that goes way back to time immemorial. There's a beautiful exhibit at the new Alfie Norval University of Arizona Mineral Museum in the old courthouse downtown, explaining how turquoise was bought and sold and traded throughout the Southwest for millennia. So maybe we should be giving some of that stuff credit for being some of the first specimen as ore mines. But Mineral Park, Morenci, Bisbee, these mines have all produced substantial amounts of turquoise, most of it done under collecting contracts between the big mining company that's operating the big industrial scale operations, recognizing that there's material that has some value to the public. For the most part, this is a drop in the bucket as far as what they're making on the big copper mines. But for years, those contracts were given, and people operated under contracts with the mining companies and produced the Sleeping Beauty, the Bisbee Blue, the Morenci Turquoise in substantial quantities to feed the demand for turquoise, primarily for jewelry.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, let's talk about some mineral specimens that have both scientific and heritage value. Lauren, you want to give us some? My notes say that you have some background in that, and you want to take yourself off mute too. Before.
Sorry, I was trying to make sure that the dog moving around didn't get included in the Zoom call as a background information while my dad was talking. One of my real fascinations is historic specimens, and sort of 2 points. One, you think about the old silver districts like Freiburg in Germany, and you see these specimens that date back to 1790s, 1800s, and you realize that that's just a percentage of what came out. That was a specimen that was just so captivating, so interesting that someone decided to stuff it down the side of their pants so they could sneak it out, or go back in the middle of the night and collect the specimen. And you see that more now as people are more aware, and collecting is a little bit more prevalent, especially in some of the mines that I visited in China, where there's a whole mining collecting or specimen collecting nighttime gig for a lot of people.
You mentioned the mine at Freiburg. That's the one that has a museum today, is it not?
Yes, and it's also where sort of one of the biggest, and actually one of the original mining and engineering universities in the world. It's the reason why, if you look at the name of the mining engineer for many mines in Africa or Mexico or even in Peru, you'll notice that they're German names, and it's because they went to the University of Freiburg, and that's where they studied mining engineering. It's a really cool school. The museums are out of this world. And when you're seeing specimens there, which give you a snapshot of what was coming out at the time, and that's one of the important things about museums, is they're libraries. They give you an idea of what was coming out. And what's brilliant is the research that's being done using these old collections. So I think it was 2020, the British Museum, with actually some material from Cornwall, they, it was a different color. And for a long time, they just said, that must be Loroconite. It's got to be the same thing. Loroconite's blue, this one's green. But then they decided to use these new technologies and apply it on this new material. And now they found kernowite. So if you have a specimen that came out in the 1700s and you can still make discovery, it really, and some of the other things that they've been working on, they found a whole new tellurium sulfate mineral called tomolite that has a really interesting structure that the material science guys, in terms of making novel materials that you can use for application in industry, they're loving that material and knowing that you can create a crystal structure like this, because there's a lot more variables in geology and a lot more time to create these things. And, when you look at that, or, there's an incredible amount of potential there in terms of application of science. But there's also something brilliant about, you can go to the Natural History Museum in New York, and you can see mineral specimens that belonged to J.P. Morgan. And you can see mineral specimens, you can go to the University of Vienna, and you'll see these absolutely huge crystals of something called pyrrhotite. Those came out of a mine in Dalnogorsk. And then you'll see this emerald crystal go from Colombia that was part of a collection trade deal between the Archduke of, because at the time it would have been the Holy Roman Empire, but Austria, anyways, he did a trade deal with the Queen of Spain, and they exchanged mineral specimens. He got the Colombian emerald, and she got mineral specimens from the Czech Republic in the Pribum district. And so being able to see these little pieces and see the exchange, and you get these snapshots in time in terms of what came out. And now there's, as collectors, we love the classics as well, because you can't get access to those because they've already come out of the ground. They came out of the ground hundreds of years ago. So can you get a little piece, a little snapshot of it? I'm lucky enough to have a specimen that came out in the 1890s, and there was one fantastic pocket, and one of the other specimens, two of the other crystals from that pocket, one's at Harvard, and one's in the British Museum. And so it's these connections between the people that collected them before. They found it beautiful. You continue to find it beautiful and interesting and engaging. And that's one of the cool parts about specimen collecting, is this linkage to history as well as science. So I guess you could say that specimen collecting is the true interdisciplinary art activity that you can do.
Now, would some of these specimens and the jewels wind up in let's say the crown jewels that they have in the crowns in England and elsewhere?
Yeah, no, and it's one of those things where you wonder, what was the mineral specimen like that got cut up to turn into that, because they all start off as a crystal. Sometimes they're broken and then they're turned into something beautiful. Sometimes something beautiful is turned into something that's been faceted. Though that's happening less now because of the value of the specimens themselves. So that's protecting some of the specimens. And the other component is that provenance, that history on specimens can also increase the value. So older specimens that have well-documented history will carry more value to collectors than the exact same specimen that came out yesterday. There's an old adage in mineral collecting where you get things when they first come out because it's possible nothing else of that's going to come out. Every once in a while, you get surprised and that material comes out later. But when it first comes out, that might be when it's at its cheapest, if no more of that material appears.
Yeah.
But
Oh, good.
you raise a really interesting point there, John, because the British crown jewels, for example, contain 4 pieces cut from the Cullinan diamond, which was one of the largest diamonds ever found in South Africa. But the crown jewels also include a number of other stones that were acquired from some of the British colonial holdings, like in places like India, which is historically an important diamond producer. And there are questions being raised today about the provenance of those stones, how they were actually acquired 150, 200 years ago. And there are not insignificant demands being made for repatriation of some of those stones because of how they were in current ways of thinking misappropriated from their original homes.
Well, I think it's probably a safe bet that they're not going to get them back.
I think watch the Elgin marbles. That'll be the first. That'll be the first chink to come through that armor.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Peter, why don't you describe for us some of the more recent trends in the mineral specimen industry? And I think for that, let's talk a little bit about the preparation of the specimens and how they're marketed. Are there other shows out there other than the Tucson show?
So let's start with sort of an overview. Lauren gave you part of it before, that the market ranges everywhere from bulk commercial materials, the kind of things that you see for sale in airport gift shops for a handful for a couple of bucks, to the individual high-end specimens that sell for multiple millions of dollars. And there's a spectrum throughout that. We talk about the high end and we talk about the commercial end of the business. And at the moment, the most recent trends that have occurred over the last 25 years is a huge growth of the high end. So there's been an absolute explosion in the value of high-end specimens. I believe I've heard people talk about numbers like appreciations on the order of 15% a year for some of these. So better investment than most things in the stock market. Again, like fine art, you need to know the business and you need to know how to get in and out. And then with the advent of the internet, we have seen a huge increase of online sales. And a lot of the materials that are sold online are what you would call the commercial end of the spectrum, but phenomenal volumes. I mean, there's some dealers out there who are selling 3,000 and 4,000 specimens a month online. That means they have to come up with 25 to 40,000 specimens a year to feed to their customers. And it's not all the same thing. So the demand profile is very broad across the market. And what has happened at the same time as the high end especially has appreciated so dramatically, there's been a shift from sort of a classic purist approach to things, where the specimens have to be the way they came out of the ground, with in some cases without even being cleaned, beyond just washing with water, to the evolution of a whole industry of specimen preparation. So you could think of it like the restoration of fine art, or you go to a dinosaur museum and you'll see the dinosaur skeletons there with clearly exhibited places where the bones have been replaced, where it's 75% natural material. They have fleshed out, pun intended, the rest of the skeleton with reasonable facsimiles of what those missing bones would have looked like. So there's now this whole industry of people taking very good specimens and trimming them to look the most aesthetic have the best aesthetics possible, subjecting them to some of the processes that have been developed in the gem world to fill fractures with various kinds of epoxies, to put luster on crystals that didn't really have very good luster to begin with. In some cases, they're actually filling missing parts of the crystals with epoxies that match optically. And the best preparers are doing this and revealing all of their restorations. There are, unfortunately, a few who do not, but the same is true in the world of fine art. You look for what you can recognize as a restoration. And this has become big business. You can take a rock, you take a specimen that's worth $10,000 and send it to what is euphemistically called the beauty shop, and it comes back looking as good as it possibly could, and it's now a $50,000 or $60,000 specimen. It cost you a couple of $1,000s to have that work done. So those kinds of things aren't done to the commercial end of the spectrum for the most part, although some of them do have coatings and things like that put on them to make them better. Some of them get heat treated. There's a lot of different things that can be done to specimens, mostly just to make them look better and more attractive to the market. So that then those wind up being marketed either on the internet or directly at shows. The Tucson show is the biggest, and that's when you take the entire 53 shows I think we're up to here in Tucson, all satellite shows surrounding the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show, because that's how popular this whole industry has become in Tucson. But the next biggest show in the world is in Munich. It just happened a couple of weeks ago. The third biggest is in Denver. That happened 2 months ago. There's a big show in France, the Summery show in the early summer. There's a couple of big shows that have sort of come and gone in China that have been absolutely massive. But Tucson remains the capital of this industry worldwide.
Now, are there many specimen only mines? I mean, obviously the mines are there to start with, to mine specific ores and minerals. Are there many specimen only mines?
Well, with the dramatic increase of value of the high-end specimens, the number of specimen only mines has grown very substantially. So I would say 30 years ago there was a handful of them. That might have included some of the pegmatite mines in Southern California, Brazil. And pegmatite, for those who don't know, these are a type of geologic formation where you get large crystals of beautiful, colorful minerals, beryls. So think aquamarine, emerald, tourmalines of various colors, big flashy quartz crystals. Those don't have a whole lot of industrial value to them, so they've always been mined for gems. But as far as specimens are concerned, the Sweet Home was certainly an early example of specimen mines, but now there's mines in California, there's mines in Nevada, there's mines in Georgia, up in New England. There have been pegmatite mines there for years, but some of them have gotten much more aggressive in terms of their focus on minerals, on specimens, because of the economic return. There's mines in Arkansas that have produced quartz for 150 years. The last big boom for those was during the Second World War, when they needed it for radio plates, for bombers and things like that. And with the increase in the value of specimens and the increase of interest of people in the metaphysical world, a number of these Arkansas localities have turned into very substantial quarries focused almost exclusively on the crystal specimens. So huge increase.
Have you seen? I assume that most of these are through contracts. Are you familiar with the type of contracts that folks would be using for this?
Well, there's two kinds of contract specimen mining. One is where you have a contract with an industrial mine, like the the turquoise you were talking about with the Ithaca Peak mine at Mineral Park, or the long-term collected contract that Southwest Minerals has had with Morenci, or more recently, Brian Lee's interactions with um, at the Twin Creeks mine in Nevada, where beautiful specimens were found in the process of gold mining. They brought him in on a contract basis to collect those. So those are all contracts that are executed between a professional collecting outfit and an operating mine. And of course, those, as you might expect, include a lot of um, attention to insurance, liability, who will do what, how much someone will be paid, and how much, and how that will be determined. And then you have at the other end things like the Sweet Home, where Brian effectively bought the mine, so he owns it, and he's essentially the owner operator. Um, and then there are people who own their own mines and operate them on a mom and pop basis, if you will, um, who have very few regulations that they actually have to follow if they own the properties outright. In a case like Brian, he has an enormous number of regulations that he has to follow operating a mine under MSHA, OSHA, and the state of Colorado. And then you have people who have properties on public lands of one kind or another, the BLM, the Forest Service. These are essentially mining claims where the argument is that the mineral specimens are the discovery, they are the ore, and so you have to operate under the aegis of the requirements of those public agencies.
The what sort of consideration, in your experience, do you have on those specimen mines? Do people pay a royalty on the specimens that they take out based on their sales prices, or they have a gross value that they pay the owner of the mine?
It depends. For the contracts that I'm aware of, for example, for Morenci, that's on a tonnage basis for the most part. So a lot of what they're taking out is boulders for yard rock and decorations and stuff like that. And the specimens are occasional and kick in another level. So they're paid for by the pound rather than by the ton. Um, and it's whatever the negotiated price is for those. For some of the others, it's done on a percentage basis of the profit that's made on the specimen. So the collector uses, at their expense, collects the material, prepares it, markets it, extracts that from the ultimate share price, and the company gets a percentage of the ultimate sales price. Most companies prefer not to operate on that basis. There's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of trust involved in things like that. It's much more straightforward to simply do it on a negotiated value per lot, and then the dealer pays the company that, and it's up to the dealer how they sell it from that point on.
Well, I can imagine in some of the more classic sources of mineral specimens, if the mine is operating, you'd have lots of issues with specimens going out in lunch boxes and elsewhere, the sort of the high grading effect.
Well, the high grading effect has always been there. Even if you have a contract with the mining company, the chances that there will be leakage through lunch boxes or back pockets or however from the actual miners is very high. That situation has created notable friction between the companies, especially some of the miners' unions and the contract specimen collectors, because In many cases, the miners, classic industrial miners, consider the specimens that are encountered their bonus. It's just something that they've historically taken out of the mine, whether with explicit or tacit permission on the part of the company. One way or the other, these things get out. And the miners come to regard that as their right. And then the company makes a deal with somebody who comes in and says, nope, you can't take those out. You can't go into this part of the mine because we've just found a big pocket here. That's perceived as taking food out of their family's mouth. And that has created some difficult situations, let's put it that way, in a couple of examples.
Well, I think that classically, in some of the high grade mines, that there was occasionally time left at the end of the work shift for the miners to fill their own pockets, if you will, and to get their bonus out of it. I suppose that's one way of controlling what was going on.
Yes, and of course, in most of those cases, that sort of thing was not specimens so much as it was high grade ore that the miners could take out and then sell to a backyard smelter or a backyard refiner, and pay for their bar tab and some other things like that. In Mexico, actually, historically, the miners were given exactly what you mentioned: time to collect material, high-grade ore on their own account. That was part of their compensation. They were expected to sell it to the company. They didn't always. And there were major riots in some of the mines in Mexico in the early 1800s when the companies tried to clamp down or eliminate that right to the miners. And my guess is very similar things happened in a lot of the mines in the Western US, especially in the gold mines, though it was a real problem. And it doesn't take a very big rock if it's mostly gold to make a substantial bonus, a self-appointed bonus, if you will, on a daily basis.
Yeah, you'd have to be real careful with the miner just setting things aside to take out with them at the end of the shift. Well, let's talk a little bit about the basis of the laws related to tenure. You've mentioned the mining law and the fact that that if on public land, that the mineral specimens are regarded as valuable in terms of making a discovery of a valuable mineral. Are you familiar with mining claims that are used for the collection of mineral specimens?
Yes, I'm actually involved with a company that has a number of claims for jade in both the states of Wyoming and Washington, which are on Forest Service and BLM land, respectively. And the mining law actually extends to gem materials of one kind or another. And so on the same kind of basis that you locate a claim for metals, you can locate it for the mineral specimens, and you have all of the rights, privileges, and obligations that stem from having done that. So the process of staking a claim is not very difficult. It's much more difficult to comply with the various kinds of regulations and permits that you have to actually dig things and extract them.
Well, it may be a little bit easier in. I don't imagine that there's that much earth movement in specimen mining than you have with the larger mineral development.
Well, that's certainly true, but you also, that's balanced by the fact that the threshold of entry into Surface mining is pretty low. I mean, you can start with picks and shovels, and you can graduate with more permits to things like backhoes and bulldozers. But it's very easy for an irresponsible collector to come into a particular branch or region of the Forest Service or the BLM, make a series of messes, and basically everybody else operating in that area, no matter how responsible they want to be, is tarred with the same brush that descends upon those who don't do things right. And at the same time, most specimen collecting doesn't go after materials that have the same kind of environmental toxicity that a lot of metal mining does. I mean, when you get into the specimens that are like at the Sweet Home, the rhodochrosites are associated with sulfide minerals. The rocks have pyrite in them. So you have all the concerns about acid mine drainage that you would have from a big mine. For a jade mine, there's pretty much nothing associated with it that creates any kind of problem except a little bit of dust. So it runs the whole gamut.
Sure. Well, can you talk a little bit about how mineral specimen mines and the miners are taxed?
Probably I could talk a very little about that. But for the most part, I mean, casual collecting, your taxes aren't part of it. I would guess that for most mining operations, specimen mining operations, the bulk of the taxes that are going to be paid are going to be sales taxes and various kinds of wage taxes that are imposed based on how many people you have working for you. I mean, I do know that in Colorado at the Sweet Home, they have to pay a Colorado state ad valorem tax on what they mine. The operations I know of here in Arizona, the only taxation I know of, because they're essentially wholesale transactions, and until you get to the retail level, most of these transactions are at the wholesale level. So if they're done by people who both have wholesale or transaction use privileges, whatever they call them under the given state law, there's not much tax imposed until it actually gets to the retail sale.
To the retail buyer, yes. Well, that makes sense.
I mean, the wholesalers still pay taxes based on their revenue, but they're not paying, for the most part, they're not paying royalties to the state. They're not paying sales tax on the material unless they're selling retail. Those are the only ones that would come to mind.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about the some labor laws, insurance, and maybe in foreign mining operations about any customs and duties related to those types of operations.
Well, the labor laws that you encounter here, I mean, we mentioned the potential conflict between labor unions and labor organizations that for people who work for the principal mining company and the specimen miners, as far as once you get into what the actual specimen collecting operation is doing in terms of labor laws. I mean, they have to follow all the same labor laws as the big mining companies do. They may not be organized miners, but they still have to, depending on how the people are hired, and some of these are contract miners, and so they get paid and they cover their expenses. But in some cases, like at the Sweet Home, Brian has a number of employees who are there, and so he's got to do all of the working man's comp and severance pay and withholding, got to apply all those laws. And it's actually one of the biggest barriers to specimen mining is that the regulations around mining are really designed based on major operations where they're spreading the cost of those, complying with regulations across every ton of ore that they mine. And when you're talking an operation that is producing at the range of pounds or just a few tons, those fixed costs can add up very quickly and very dramatically impact the economics of the operation. As we all know, in today's world, insurance, especially liability insurance, is a significant expense, and mines are inherently risky places to work. So typically liability insurance for working a mine can be pretty expensive. Getting into, and depending on where you're working in the world, they may be lower in some places, but when you look at the UN regulations and the increased demand for everybody to behave well on a worldwide basis, if you're going to do this sort of thing with substantial investment involved, you want to follow all the rules, whether you're forced to or not, because it's a lot cheaper to do things right at the beginning than it is to try to fix it after you've had a problem.
Sure. What has been your experience, Peter, in importing specimens from outside the United States?
Well, to some degree, it depends on where they're from. But for the most part, what are referred to as unimproved mineral specimens under the customs code are duty free. Now, there are some tariffs that sort of wound up spilling into that world that were imposed during the Trump administration. Most of those have been rolled back. But so unless you're importing cut goods, whether it's finished lapidary materials, so polished figurines, bookends, faceted stones, cabochons, those things all have a schedule of duty that you pay on them. For unimproved specimens, you have to, if it's under $2,500, I believe that's the threshold, you can do an informal entry. For over that, you have to declare that you're bringing it in and what the value is, but there's no tariff or duty imposed on that material. You will get a letter from the IRS about a year after you bring it in saying, we know you brought this in. We certainly hope it shows up on your tax return. But I've never heard of anyone actually running afoul of that to any kind of significant degree.
Are there any sort of taxes imposed by the host country where you're obtaining the material?
Sometimes. Most of my experience is bringing things out of Mexico, and because of the various free trade agreements and things like that, Mexico imposes no export tax. There are other countries that do. Russia does, for example, and there's a lot of material that has come out of Russia over the last 30 years. There are a few countries that require various kinds of antiquities forms to be filled out. In other words, some countries consider fossils and minerals to be antiquities, and so they're governed the same way as archaeological artifacts. That's not the case under the US code or under the code from Mexico or Canada. But you do run into that, especially in a lot of the Middle Eastern countries and Europe, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you for all of this, Lauren. We've sort of left you out of this discussion. Do you have anything that you'd like to add to what your father has talked about?
In terms of mining law, that's definitely not something I'm as aware of. But, one thing that I would mention, just because it's something I've looked into in the past, is there are certain areas where, mineral specimen collecting is actually illegal. There's some national forest land, there's some national park land where mining is restricted. And so occasionally issues do pop up relative to specimens that are known to be from those areas, and how those are handled, which can create some interesting elements every once in a while. And the other component that I would sort of mention at the end here is, if you're a young person and you're interested in collecting, there is a group called Young Mineral Collectors, or YMC. And you can really get a sense of the depth of the collecting realm, whether it's micro minerals, sort of more of general collecting, species specific. There's even some young collectors that are sort of on that trophy end of things. And so, this isn't the specimen collecting and putting together mines specifically for specimens isn't something that's fleeting, and it looks like it's something that's going to even become more of a case moving forward into the future. So really appreciate you focusing on this.
Good. Well, Peter and Lauren, thank you very much for a really very thorough and interesting discussion of the mineral collection business, and it fits right in with our evolution of the mining industry. So I thank you very much.
Well, it's a real pleasure, John. Thank you very much for inviting us.
You're welcome.